Hi guys, this is Ms. Romani, and this week you're going to be learning about disease transmission. And basically, what this lesson is about how diseases spread. We're going to be focusing on pathogens and pathogenic diseases. So, pathogens, if you might recall, are things like viruses and bacteria and fungi and protists that cause what are called infectious diseases. And these infectious diseases can spread within a population. So, the question we're going to be asking ourselves is how are they spread? And we're going to be focusing on three main ways by which diseases can be spread by contact, by vehicle, or something called vector transmission. A lot of the topics that you're going to be learning on this lesson are probably things that you already know about. That, for example, a lot of you might be aware that you can get disease transmitted by someone sneezing nearby. We're just going to basically be categorizing a lot of the different methods of disease transmission and just giving a little bit more terminology to some of the stuff that you probably already know. So, the first type of transmission of disease is probably the one that you might think of first of all when you think about disease transmission, and we call that contact transmission. There's actually two categories of contact transmission: direct contact and indirect contact. During direct contact, like the name implies, basically disease is spread when there's actual touching between one person or another. So usually examples of direct contact might be by a touch, by a kiss. Sexual contact and sexually transmitted diseases would fall under direct contact transmission. So anytime that there is basically some sort of touching happening between a healthy person and an infected person, and in which some sort of fluids can be exchanged, whether it be um, blood or saliva or anything like that, and oftentimes then that involves the direct touching between one person and another. Another type of contact transmission is actually indirect contact. And indirect contact actually does not involve touching a person directly who is sick, but touching something that has been touched by the person who has been sick. And that something has now become infected with the disease organisms. We call those inanimate objects that have become infected with diseased organisms fomites. So, fomites can be things like a doorknob that has been touched by someone who was sick and they transferred the virus, say, for example, or the bacteria to the doorknob. And then when you go touch that doorknob, you now have picked up that virus or bacteria, and oftentimes by touching your face, you transmit it into your own body. So the doorknob is a fomite. Another very common fomite are things like needles that are dirty with someone else's disease. So you've heard often about be careful about dirty needles. Well, that's the reason why, because dirty needles are fomites. They have been coming in contact with a patient, an infected person's blood, and then they can transmit it to a healthy person. So that would be indirect contact. So you're not touching another person who's sick directly, but you're touching something that has touched their body. Vehicle transmission basically involves any type of transmission that does not involve the direct contact with another person. So this is transmission of disease that can be done through food, water, and air. So oftentimes we get what are called foodborne diseases, and the vehicle of transmission for the disease is food. So this is often because of improper sanitation, like for example, if somebody who is cooking the food does not wash their hands properly, and then they can transfer their own bacteria or viruses onto the food that they're cooking. Oftentimes it could also be through undercooking food. So if there is a pathogen, like say for example a bacteria in meat or chicken or any other food, and you don't cook it at a high enough heat, then the bacteria will not die and you can then be sick from that. So this is, for example, two common ones that you would have heard about would be, say for example, salmonella. Salmonella is a disease that is caused by a bacteria that is transmitted through undercooked poultry, so usually chicken and eggs. It's fine if it's cooked properly, and this is why you never want to eat raw or undercooked chicken, because the heat basically kills the bacteria. But if it's not cooked properly, then some of the bacteria might have survived, and that can cause what is basically food poisoning. E. coli is the same way. E. coli is most often found in undercooked ground beef, because there's high quantities of highly pathogenic and dangerous E. coli in cow manure. And so oftentimes that E. coli can get into the meat in food processing plants. And so if the meat is ground up, very oftentimes then the E. coli can be found within a burger patty, say, for example. And if it's not cooked properly, then the bacteria will not die. Similarly, you can have waterborne diseases. So these are diseases that are passed along through drinking contaminated water. Usually that water has been contaminated by human or animal feces that then carry a protist or a bacteria, and then it gets deposited into water systems through raw sewage or just because animals poop in the water. And then when people drink water that has not been treated properly, that has not gone through the proper sanitation process that water usually goes through in order to kill any sort of pathogenic bacteria and protists and anything else out of it, then the person can get sick from that organism. And so usually this is a problem in developing countries that do not have proper sanitation for their water. If you've probably heard about traveler's diarrhea basically can come from drinking the water in countries that did not have the same level of sanitation that we do here in Canada. So the water may be contaminated with a protist, like say, for example, amoebic dysentery is a protist, or a bacteria like say cholera, or sometimes just also E. coli can be found in the water. A third category of vehicle transmission is what we call airborne transmission, and as the name indicates, it's basically diseases that can be breathed in. So you basically can transmit it through the air. And the way that these diseases are transmitted is usually the pathogens, the viruses or the bacteria, can survive for a determined amount of time. It varies depending on the virus and bacteria, and droplets of either dust or body fluids in the air, which are called aerosols. So aerosols are what we call those droplets that can survive in the air that can then be breathed in by someone else, and then that person becomes infected. And there's a couple of things that can differentiate different diseases and their ability to be transmitted from one person to another through airborne means, and that is how long the disease can survive in the air and how far this disease can travel in the air when expelled by the body. So for example, if you look at this picture right here that you have at the bottom right, you can see that a disease like Ebola, which is not very known to be an airborne disease, cannot travel very far when somebody, say, sneezes or coughs and then expels the disease in the air. To begin with, Ebola is transmitted by blood transmission. And so basically, let's say somebody coughs up blood that has the virus, it's not going to travel that far. At most, it would travel up to 3 feet and in the air. Whereas a disease like measles can travel well over 6 feet in the air. As you guys know, with the current pandemic, we are asked to keep a 6 feet or 2 meter distance away from each other. And that's because the coronavirus has been known to travel up to 6 feet in the air when someone coughs and who has the disease. So a person who coughs, who has the disease, can produce aerosol droplets that can survive and can move up to 6 feet, as far as we know. And the other thing is then also how long it survives. So for example, a disease like measles can survive in the air for up to 2 hours, and a disease like tuberculosis, which is very contagious, can survive up to 4 hours. And those two are diseases that can actually have a very long survival rate in the air. Most diseases, like say, for example, a cold or a flu, might survive just a few minutes in the air. So for example, for you to get a cold from someone who also has a cold through through aerosol contagion, you would have to be near a person when they sneeze or cough in order to then breathe in the air that has that live virus and put it in your body. Whereas somebody could say, for example, get in an elevator and cough, and if they have tuberculosis, say, for up to 4 hours, anyone getting in that same elevator would be able to get sick from that, from the aerosol droplets in the air. So that gives a much higher infection rate. One other disease that is transmitted through aerosols and is actually not transmitted from human to human is the hantavirus. Hantavirus is actually transmitted via dust particles that go in the air that contains dried up feces or urine from mice that have the hantavirus. And so this is the disease that is transmitted not from one person coughing or sneezing, but just by being in the same area where you have an infestation of mice, usually is field mice that live in wooded areas that are infected with the hantavirus, and then they deposit that virus in their poop and their urine, and when that gets dried up and becomes dust, someone can breathe that into their body, and then that's how they get sick. So you have to kind of be careful if you go to, say, someone's cottage or a trailer, and if you know they have a mice infestation, sometimes there's hantavirus, and that's basically how most people get infected with that. So that's vehicle transmission, and the next is something called vector transmission. Now, you may have heard the word vector before. This has nothing to do with math or physics. In this particular case, a vector is an animal, typically an insect or some other type of arthropod, that can transmit disease from one person to another. The key with the vector transmission here is that the vector itself does not get sick from the pathogen. So, for example, ticks, specifically deer ticks, are vectors for a disease called Lyme disease. Now, the deer will get Lyme disease and people will get Lyme disease, and the tick will basically bite a person or a deer or a dog or any kind of mammal and suck out their blood, and it is in that blood that the Lyme disease virus lives. So the tick doesn't get sick, though. This tick basically is just a method of transmission for the disease. Similarly, you have mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are vectors for a variety of different diseases. Most well known is malaria, but there's also the Zika virus that caused a lot of panic a few years ago. Usually, West Nile virus is one disease that we see more here in northern areas that are transmitted by mosquitoes. And so vectors, like I said, are just the animal that transmits disease from one person to another or an animal to another, but they themselves don't get sick. So there's a difference between that and, say, for example, a disease like rabies, or even hantavirus, say, where the animal themselves has the disease. Okay. So next we're going to talk about then how diseases can enter our body or exit our body for transmission. And so this is what we call portals of entry and portals of exit. So portal of entry, as the name implies, is basically a site through which a disease can enter. And I'm sure you can think of a lot of these on your own but let's just kind of lay them all out here. Just so we can make sure that you get them all. So one of the ways by which we can get a disease into our body is by breathing it in. So our respiratory tract is a portal of entry. Another portal of entry is our gastrointestinal tract. So we can either drink water that has a disease or eat food that has a disease. So we can consume that into our body through our GI tract. Another one could be skin penetration. You can get cuts, bites, injections. Those are different ways of getting a disease into your body, and any of our mucous membranes. So we can get a portal of entry could be our eyes, our nose, our genitals. So any of those. And this is the reason why they say don't touch your face, because you have your nose or your mouth or your eyes through which disease can get into your body. And I like this picture a lot. It shows this poor woman. She's having a terrible day because essentially she is having disease enter her body in so many different ways. Apparently, according to the picture, she just breathed in some influenza. At the same time, she's being bitten by a malaria carrying mosquito. So here's a vector form of disease. She breathed in some influenza aerosols. She's been injected with an IV drug user's needle that may carry maybe some HIV uh, or some other type of virus. So now you have here, that's a fomite, right? She also ate some, let's say, undercooked chicken and gave her salmonella. So this is a foodborne vehicle transmission. She also had a cut that has now been infected by tetanus. She's getting a hookworm, a parasitic worm that basically burrows under the skin, going through her skin, and she's being bitten by a rabid dog. So this poor woman is not going to have a very easy time. So similarly to portals of entry, we have portals of exit. And so a portal of entry is how a healthy person can get sick. A portal of exit is basically the site through which a pathogen can exit a sick person so that it can then go on to infect a healthy person. So let's say this woman here in this picture is diseased, so she herself has a lot of diseases, and so she can now transmit those diseases to others by, say, for example, through her respiratory tract, by coughing and sneezing, in her body waste, in her feces and in her urine, through her blood. Say, for example, she gets an injection and some of her blood is removed and that needle is used for someone else, or maybe she has an open cut and then she can, pass some disease along that way to someone else. And through insect bites. So say, for example, if she gets bitten by a mosquito and she happens to have malaria, right? So next, we're going to just talk a little bit about what can determine how fast a disease can spread. And one thing that you might have heard about is something called the R naught number. The R naught, or basic reproduction number, is an epidemiology data point that is used to basically predict how quickly a disease will spread in a population. So the R naught number, or is usually given the capital letter R with a lower subscript O next to it, is basically a number that tells an average number of people that one infected person can transmit the disease to. So if you have one infected person, how many people will they likely on average infect in order to then predict how quickly a disease can spread through a population? So for example, a disease like the flu, the common flu, has an R naught of 1.5. So a typical person who has the flu on average will transmit that flu virus to 1.5 people. Obviously, there's no such thing as half a person. So picture it as 2 people with the flu can transmit the disease to 3 different people. Hepatitis C, for example, has an R naught of 2. So one person with hepatitis would usually give the disease to 2 people. Ebola also has an R naught of 2. HIV has an R naught of 4. SARS had an R naught of 4 as well. And then 2 of the most contagious diseases are something like mumps, which has an R naught of 10, and the measles, which is 18. So that means that one person with the measles could pass along and spread the disease to 18 other people as long as they're not vaccinated, right? And so this can give us an idea of how quickly a disease will spread in a population, and then it can give epidemiologists an idea of how to contain the disease better. If you're wondering what the R naught for COVID-19 is, we're not sure yet. The numbers vary depending on where we're looking at in the studies. The numbers are just coming in for that. So right now the range is being given as between 2 and 3.5. And that is because there's many things that can actually affect the spread of the disease. For example, when countries and populations go under quarantine, the R naught goes down. And so in some populations, the R naught could be as low as like 1.5. But in places where there's a high density of population and people are not quarantining, the R naught could be higher. So it's hard to say. So why is there, though, that there's such a difference between the R naughts between different diseases? So one of the things that we have to look at then is whether or not someone who is exposed to a disease will actually become sick and become infected by the disease. As we saw before when we were looking at different methods of transmission, um, different diseases can survive different amounts of time in the air or can be transmitted by, say, mosquitoes or other animals. So there's a variety of different things that can determine the transmission of a disease. But even when you are exposed to the disease, there are three factors that will determine whether or not you will actually get sick. And that varies depending on the pathogen. And the first thing that might vary is the dose. How much of that organism has to enter your body for you to get sick? So for some diseases, you only need to have maybe a couple of organisms, say for example, a couple of bacteria or a couple of viruses enter your body for then a person to actually get infected. But for some diseases, you might need a bigger dose for that to result in infection. The next thing is the virulence of the disease. The strength of the organism. Some disease pathogens are more virulent than others. So the virulence will determine how good your body will be at fighting the organism. And some diseases are so strong that most people who get exposed to it will get sick from it, whereas others might be a lot weaker, and most people who are exposed to that pathogen will be able to fight it off no problem. Which brings me to my third factor, which is resistance, the ability of the immune system to fight the infection. And resistance can vary in a population as well. So some people's immune systems might be stronger than others. And so how much of the organism entered your body, how strong that organism is, and your ability to fight it off, your own immune system's strength, are going to determine whether or not you're going to get sick. Even if you've been exposed to a disease or not. So exposure doesn't necessarily mean infection. Exposure just means you've come in contact with a pathogen. Infection means that now you become sick with the disease. So some people could become exposed to a pathogen and be fine. And some situations you might be exposed to a pathogen and be sick. It all depends on how much of that organism went in, the dose, how strong that organism is, the virulence, and how good you were at fighting the disease, your resistance. And lastly, we're going to take a look at something called an epidemiologic triangle. And this is basically a tool that is used by epidemiologists to figure out the characteristics, three main characteristics or cause of any disease that are then going to be used in order to help fight the disease, because you cannot fight what you don't understand. And so before we can start fighting a disease and reducing the spread of a disease in a population, we need to know more about it. And the three things that we need to know about are the host, the agent, and the environment. So what are they? So start with the agent. The agent is very simple. It's the cause of the disease. The what. What caused the disease? Was it a virus? Was it a bacteria? Was it a protist? If it's biological in nature, what was it? So for example, a disease outbreak happens, epidemiologists go on site, and they might determine, this was caused by a coronavirus. That's the what, that's the agent, the cause of the disease. Diseases, remember, do not always have to be caused by a biologic agent or pathogen. The what could be a chemical. Maybe you see a rash of, lung cancers. And so then the agent could be, it turns out it was, cigarette smoking or vaping or a poison in the air or pollution. It could be a physical event like trauma, or it could be a nutritional thing. So, if there is an outbreak of diabetes or heart disease, you might find out that there's a nutritional cause. So the agent is the cause of the disease. It doesn't always have to be a living thing. So for infectious diseases, though, the agent is always going to be a pathogen, usually a microbe, but different pathogens can have different biological properties, And so those are the things that need to be studied, like how long do they survive? What type of genetic material do they have, and so on? How do they reproduce? The next part is the host. And the host is basically the individuals that get sick, and not just who gets sick, this is the who, not just who gets sick, but what are their characteristics. But mostly when we're talking about the host, we're talking about the people or the animals that get sick. So we call those the animal carriers that may or may not get sick. So for example, if it's a zoonotic disease, these are diseases that are caused by animals, and the animals themselves are sick. So for example, Ebola is actually caused by bats that can transmit the disease to people. HIV, it is known that HIV originally came from chimpanzees in Africa. We don't know exactly where the coronavirus came from, but it is believed to have a zoonotic origin. That means that some sort of animal, most likely a bat, but we're not sure yet, basically brought it into the human population. And it could also be vectors like insects, like ticks or mosquitoes that can be the host. Another part of describing the host is describing who, out of, say, if people who get sick are more susceptible to the disease or might have different reactions to the disease. So for example, if you're looking at a disease like chickenpox, right? Chickenpox in adults is a much more dangerous disease than chickenpox in children. So that is something that goes under that category of understanding who gets the disease. It's not just saying, oh, people get it. Yes, but out of the people who get it, who are more likely to have, more dangerous, more life-threatening symptoms? Children usually get over chickenpox fairly easily. Adults might end up with complications. Or something like COVID-19. When we're looking at COVID-19, the WHO is very important, because if you're looking at, a young, healthy person getting the disease, is not as concerning as when you're looking at an older person or someone with a compromised immune system, or somebody who has some of the other health factors that make the disease worse, like it's been known that obesity and diabetes actually are factors that make a person more likely to have complications. And last is the environment. So the environment is in the conditions that allow the disease to be transmitted. And so this is the where. So some pathogens, for example, live best in dirty water. Others survive better in the air. Others survive in blood. Some pathogens thrive in warm, humid conditions, but might be killed by high heat. Some of them, get killed by cold weather. Some of them actually get killed by warmer weather. So these are important when determining on how we're going to fight a disease. So temperature, humidity, altitude. It could also be crowding, situations when you have pathogens that are better transmitted in more enclosed spaces, or in the air, or in the water. Those are different modes of transmissions that can in fact affect the environment. For example, a disease like the flu, it's more common during flu season, which is usually somewhere between October to about February. Why those months? Why not during the summer? Well, one of the theories is that the flu virus doesn't do very well in warmer temperatures, so this is when the weather gets colder. And the other theory is that the flu virus sort of follows a time when people are going to be spending more time in enclosed spaces, in high density areas with each other. So for example, offices, and also in school. So these are things that can affect the transmission, and knowing about that can help fight it, right? So why do we need to know this? Why is it important to understand both the agent, the host, and the environment of the disease? And that is because when we know the factors, then we can help disrupt their interaction with each other and therefore minimize the spread of the disease. Because all three of these need to be in place for a disease outbreak to occur. You have to have an agent, it has to be the right environment, and you have to have the proper host. So if you find a way of disrupting, of minimizing any of these three factors, then we can start stopping the spread of a disease. For example, vaccinations. Vaccinations are actually very helpful at stopping the spread of a disease. As you guys know, right now, scientists are very busy looking for a vaccine that might help fight the current pandemic, because that is a way that we can stop the spread of the disease. So what's happening when you have a vaccination? Where a vaccination basically is affecting the host. We're making the host less likely to get the disease. So the host being humans who get sick. If you make humans immune to the disease by vaccinating them, then that disrupts that one factor. And so you can still have the right environment and the agent, but without hosts that are susceptible to the disease, then you're going to stop the spread. If the hosts become immune by vaccines, the disease spread is going to stop. Mosquito fumigation also disrupts the host. So, for example, one of the most tried and true tested ways of stopping malaria spread is to fumigate areas so that you kill the mosquitoes. Because remember, people get malaria, but malaria is transmitted by the vector, the mosquito, that passes it along from one person to another. So if you kill the mosquitoes, which is a host, because remember the animal vectors are hosts, then you're disrupting the transmission of disease. Cooking food, washing hands, that disrupts the agent. For example, washing your hands for over 20 seconds kills the viruses in your hands and the bacteria in your hands. Well, then that disrupts the agent. Or when you cook food or boil water that has been contaminated, where you're basically, heating and killing the agent. This is affecting the agent directly. You're killing the bacteria, you're killing the virus, you're killing the parasites and fungi. Environment can be disrupted by basically, say for example, making clean water available. If you have a disease like cholera that is transmitted by dirty water, or you can disrupt the environment by, avoiding people hanging out in big groups if you have a disease that is better transmitted through high density population areas. So those are factors that can be disrupted by a variety of different means. So let's practice a little bit. Let's say you have a disease like rabies, right? So for rabies, the hosts are humans, because humans get rabies, but also the infected animals that have transmitted it to humans. Usually humans don't get rabies from other humans. It's not like humans often get rabies by being bitten by another human. Okay, it can happen, but that's not the mode of transmission. The mode of transmission is going to be in humans and infected mammals, like oftentimes bats or dogs. The agent is a virus. The virus is called the rabies lyssavirus. So that's the agent. And the environment are areas where you might have wild animals, maybe areas that have wild bats around, or feral cats or dogs in an area. Another disease would be, say, for example, malaria. So what's the host in malaria? Well, there's actually two hosts again, humans and the vector, the Aedes mosquito, which is the mosquito that transmits malaria from human to human. And by the way, this type of mosquito, the species of mosquito, cannot survive outside of tropical areas, which is the reason that malaria is more common in tropical regions of the world and not in northern or more temperate regions. So those are your hosts. Now, as far as humans are concerned, though, you might actually put a little bit more information there if you wanted to. You could just also say that children are more likely to die of malaria than older humans, than adults. The agent is a protist. The Plasmodium protist is what actually causes malaria, and the environment are the tropical climates where there are lots of mosquitoes. So tropical areas that have a lot of woodland, that has a lot of mosquitoes, those are the environments that are more likely to, to lead to malaria transmission. And that's the end of the lesson for today. So thank you for watching, everybody. Have a great day. Talk to you later.